Today we're looking at Civil War advantages and disadvantages. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bellringer. Please don't forget to subscribe and take a look at the questions down in the description. Also, I'd love to see your answer to question number 5 in the comments below. So today, as we're really beginning looking at the Civil War, it's kind of important to look and see what the advantages were for the North or the Union compared to the South or the Confederacy. So first off, the advantages for the Union really at the outset of the Civil War and throughout the war were really overwhelming. And it's kind of amazing to see that the South was even able to last as long as they were when you compare these advantages. So, for one, the North had a much larger population. It's estimated at the time of the Civil War that the total population of the United States was about 31 million people. Of that, 22 million people lived in northern states compared to only 9 million that lived in southern states. And of that 9 million, 4 million were enslaved people. And of course, southern states of the Confederacy were not about to allow enslaved people to be armed and fight in the war, although it is interesting to see the contribution that they made to the Confederate cause. And actually, I'll post an article below in the comments about the contribution of enslaved people during the Civil War to the Confederate cause. But this much larger population for the North meant that they had a much bigger, I guess, human resource base to draw from to be able to fight in the war. Secondly, and arguably one of the biggest advantages the North has was, of course, their industry. As you studied the period of sectionalism, hopefully you've seen that the North and the South developed very differently, with the North having an industrial-based economy, while the South almost purely was agriculturally driven. And so it's estimated that there were over 100,000 factories in the North at the outset of the war, compared to barely 21,000 factories located in southern states. And so this meant the North could produce large amounts of war materials, guns, ammunition, artillery, shoes, uniforms. In fact, it's interesting when you look at Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers during the war, you'll notice that Union soldiers are always wearing a uniform, while Confederate soldiers, for the most part, were generally just fighting in whatever they had on, just simply because they did not have the materials or the industry to support their troops. Next, we have transportation. By the time of the Civil War, the Union, or the North, had developed a very extensive railroad network across the northern states. Somewhere around 22,000 miles of tracks crisscrossed the North, compared to only around 9,000 miles in the South. This made it much easier for the North to transport troops and war materials from one place to another. And then for the South, to add to their problems of their 9,000 miles, many of them were different gauges of track, which means, different width of tracks depending on what rail line you were on. And so that meant, one train couldn't go all the way across the South. They had to actually, physically unload things from one train to another. So that added to their problems. Next, the North had a very large navy. At the outset of the war, maybe not that big, but they go through a huge expansion, all right? By the end of the war, they've built over 600 ships, making it the largest navy in the world at the time of the Civil War. And so they use this, large navy to blockade southern ports. They also use it to launch several successful attacks along the Mississippi River against Confederate targets. Meanwhile, for the South, though, even though they didn't have a very big navy, or really no navy to speak of at all, they made up for it with technology, I guess you would say, by developing ironclad ships, and then also, developing the first submarine to successfully carry out an attack during the Civil War. Now, advantages for the South compared to the North. One of the major advantages the Confederacy had was a wealth of well-trained officers. Really, it's remarkable to see that the Confederacy even lasted as long as they did compared to the advantages for the North. But arguably one of the biggest reasons they last for as long as they did is because most of the strong military leadership went with the South. Confederate commanders such as Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson helped the Confederates to win very unlikely victories during the war, while it seemed the North just had one inept commander after another, especially early in the war. And it took a few years before Lincoln was able to find some commanders that were capable and were able to lead the Union to victory. Also, the Confederacy was fighting with, I guess you would say, a stronger fighting spirit. Many Southerners considered the Civil War to be the Second American Revolution. In fact, many of them called the War of Northern Aggression. And so they felt like, in their minds, they felt they were fighting to defend their homes and that they were fighting to defend their states' rights rights, even though unfortunately the major state right they're fighting for was to defend the institution of slavery. But you have to remember, in the 1800s, a lot of people were more committed to their state rather than to their country. And so, you could argue that Union troops having to march into the South were not fighting with as much, fight as Confederates trying to save their homes, if they believed. And then also the Confederacy was fighting a defensive war. They had a much easier position. The Union had to actually physically march into the South and force the Confederacy to rejoin the Union. And so this made it easier for the Confederates. Okay, so hopefully you learned something there, and thanks for watching.